The morning I stood at the edge of the private lake, the water was so still it looked like glass, and for a moment I wondered if my father's voice was somehow trapped inside it. He used to say this land didn't just belong to us, we belonged to it. What I didn't know then was that within 24 hours, this same lake would become the center of a quiet war, one that an entire HOA never saw coming, and one that would change every life around it forever. Stay with me, because what happened after they kicked my dad out would leave even them questioning who really owns power. My father spent his whole life working land that was never truly his, fixing fences, managing water flow, keeping the lake clean for people who barely knew his name. He was the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and believed respect was earned through silence and sweat. When the HOA took over the surrounding development years ago, they tolerated him because he was useful. He lived in a modest caretaker's cabin near the lake, paid almost nothing, and never complained. But the moment my grandmother passed and the land deeds came into question, their tone shifted. Suddenly, he was out of compliance. Suddenly, his cabin violated bylaws no one had enforced in decades. One cold afternoon, they handed him a notice and escorted him off land he had protected longer than any of them had lived there. I got the call that night. My dad didn't cry, but his voice sounded smaller, like the land had already started slipping away from him. He stayed with me in my tiny apartment, his boots by the door, mud still clinging to them as if refusing to accept exile. I didn't sleep. Something felt unfinished, like a story that had skipped a page. The next morning, a lawyer called. My grandmother, quiet and underestimated even in death, had left everything to me. Not just the caretaker's plot. Not just the lake, 2,300 acres. Every water right, every access easement, including the one single pipeline feeding the HOA's private water system. When I drove back the next day, the HOA board was already meeting. Smiles, clipboards, confidence. They spoke to me like I was a formality, a signature to be managed. They didn't know I'd spent the night reading deeds and water rights older than their entire neighborhood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just asked one question. Did you authorize the removal of my tenant yesterday? They laughed. Said caretakers aren't tenants. Said the land belonged to the community. That's when I realized they had never once checked who truly owned what they depended on. By noon, their sprinklers sputtered. By evening, taps ran brown. Panic spread faster than any official notice. The lake was fine, clear, calm, untouched. But the pipeline valve, legally and fully on my land, was shut. Not destroyed, not sabotaged, simply closed, perfectly lawful. That night, my dad and I sat by the water again, the same place he taught me how to fish, and for the first time, he smiled, not out of revenge, but relief. Yet this wasn't the end. This was just the moment before the storm broke. The next morning, the HOA showed up in force, lawyers, board members, angry homeowners filming on their phones. They accused me of cruelty, of punishing families, of abusing power. I listened. I let them talk themselves hoarse. Then I laid the documents on the hood of my truck, one by one, like cards in a slow, deliberate game. Deeds, water rights, survey maps. Silence followed. The kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to face their own arrogance. I told them the water would return when my father's cabin was restored, when a public apology was issued, and when they acknowledged that land stewardship isn't ownership, it's responsibility. Some scoffed, some begged, but the truth hit them hardest when inspectors arrived and confirmed it all. They had built a luxury community on borrowed grace, assuming permanence without permission. By the third day, agreements were signed. The cabin was repaired, better than before. My father was offered compensation, but he refused most of it. He only asked to stay, to keep caring for the land like he always had. When the valve reopened, water flowed again, clearer than before. The HOA's power, however, never fully returned. Standing by the lake at sunset, I understood my grandmother's final lesson. Real inheritance isn't land or water or leverage. It's knowing when to stand firm without becoming cruel, when to protect what matters without losing yourself. The HOA learned that titles don't make you untouchable. My father learned that quiet dignity, when backed by truth, can move mountains, or dry lakes. And if you're still listening, remember this. Sometimes the people you overlook are the ones holding everything together. Treat them well, because when respect dries up, even the deepest water can disappear overnight. The night my father was thrown off the land, he didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't even ask why. He just picked up his old duffel bag, looked back at the lake one last time, and said something that still chills me: "They think this place is theirs now." That sentence was the hook in my mind, the one that kept replaying, because I didn't know then that by the next morning, the same people who humiliated him would be begging for a single drop of water. My dad had lived on that land for nearly 30 years. He wasn't rich, wasn't important in the way people with titles think matters. He was the caretaker, the guy who woke before sunrise to check the lake levels, cleared debris after storms, and made sure the water stayed clean enough for everyone's picture-perfect views. The HOA barely acknowledged him unless something went wrong. To them, he was part of the scenery, useful, silent, invisible. When the neighborhood expanded and property values skyrocketed, that invisibility turned into inconvenience. One complaint became 10, 10 became a meeting, and suddenly they decided his small cabin was unauthorized. No warning, no discussion, just a notice and a security escort. When he came to stay with me that night, he placed his boots neatly by the door like he was still a guest in his own life. We sat in silence for a long time. I wanted to be angry, to promise revenge, but all I felt was confusion. How could they do this so easily? That's when my phone rang. A lawyer I barely remembered meeting once told me my grandmother's estate had finally cleared probate. Her farmland, long rumored but never discussed, was officially mine. I laughed at first, thinking it was some small plot. Then he said the number. 2,300 acres. Including the lake, including the water rights, including the infrastructure feeding the entire HOA. Sleep never came. By dawn, the shock had settled into clarity. This wasn't about payback, it was about truth. When I drove back to the property, the lake looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm, patient, unbothered by human arrogance. The HOA board was already gathered, smug and confident, assuming I was there to negotiate, to plead, to accept their authority. I listened as they explained how things worked around here. That was their mistake. They assumed power because they'd never been challenged. I asked one simple question about my father. They dismissed it like it didn't matter. So I left, quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I went straight to the control point on my land and closed the valve. Perfectly legal, perfectly calm. By midday, residents noticed low pressure. By evening, faucets coughed out murky drips. Panic spread faster than gossip ever had. And that night, sitting beside my father, I realized this story was no longer about what they took from him, but about what they never respected. The next morning, the HOA arrived angry, loud, and desperate. Phones recording, lawyers posturing, homeowners shouting about children and lawns and inconvenience. I let them speak. Every accusation bounced off the truth they refused to face. When I laid the documents out, every deed, every water right, every signature older than their entire development, the noise died. You could hear the lake behind us, still full, still generous, still mine. They accused me of cruelty, but I reminded them cruelty is throwing an old man out of his home without a conversation. I told them the water would return when my father's dignity was restored. Not money, not favors, respect. Inspections confirmed everything I said. Their power had always been borrowed, and now the bill was due. By the third day, apologies came. Real ones. The cabin was rebuilt, improved, officially recognized. My father was offered compensation and a formal title. He accepted the role, not the money. When the valve opened, water flowed again, clear and steady. But something else had changed. They no longer looked past him. They no longer looked down on us. Standing by the lake at sunset, I finally understood the inheritance. It wasn't the acres. It wasn't the water. It was the responsibility to protect people who give their lives quietly, without applause. If you've stayed with me this long, remember this: power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits patiently, like water behind a valve, until the moment it's needed most.